You steal a loaf of bread, but instead of prison, your hand is cut off. You kill a man, and you are banished forever and left to die in the wild. Welcome to Viking justice, where there were no jails, only brutal punishments. While medieval Europe relied on dark dungeons and endless imprisonment,
it was so tight in the cell that a prisoner could not stand up, sit down, and had to just crouch over for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The word oubliette comes from the French to forget, and when you ended up in there, you were left for dead.
the Vikings had no use for such wasteful systems. In true Viking way, justice had to be swift, decisive, and absolute. Some sagas speak of temporary underground pits where prisoners were held before facing their fate, but make no mistake, once judgment was passed, there was no second chance. Viking law was brutal, efficient, and sometimes shockingly creative. But was it all blood and violence, or was the Viking legal system more advanced than we think? Let's find out. This is Viking History with Magnus. Remember to subscribe for more interesting videos about the Vikings. Law and order in Viking society were upheld through the Thing, a great assembly where disputes were settled, punishments declared, and laws forged. It was one of the earliest forms of democracy where every free man had the right to speak, whether rich or poor. Well, not slaves and most free women. Women's liberation was still nearly 1,000 years away, though noble women could sometimes voice their concerns. Free women could bring a case forward, but it was her husband or male kin who would fight her legal battle. At the heart of the Thing stood the jury, with at least 12 and sometimes up to 36 jurors weighing the evidence before a final sentence was delivered. Presiding over it all was the law speaker, an elder who knew every law by heart and commanded deep respect within the community. His word was the final seal of justice, deciding whether a man walked free or faced a punishment worse than death.
I have taken the advice of the gods. If they had wanted him dead, he would have died in battle. But they spared, and therefore, I conclude, the gods have made their own judgment, which I cannot overturn. I therefore order this man be set free.
If you lost the case at the Thing, there were 4 main ways you could face punishment. You could get fines, become an outlaw, or face execution. But it was also possible to pay your way out of it with what we today would call blood money. The cost of this depended on status. Taking the life of a nobleman was astronomically expensive, while killing a slave was a fraction of the cost. Instead of punishing an offender outright, a monetary price was placed on a person's life, and you could pay their family in silver rather than face other brutal forms of punishment. Vikings lived in a kin-based society where the entire family was responsible for an individual's actions, so killing a man required both the perpetrator and his family to pay compensation. We have a historical example of fines from Norway. In one such case, 189 cows was set as the price the family had to pay for killing a neighbor. Converted to today's value, this would amount to: the killer must pay the equivalent to $91,000 in today's money. His brother $32,000, and even distant relatives had to pay fines from $1,500 up to $4,000, a fortune in the Viking Age. If you couldn't pay, a much harsher fate awaited you. For those who refused to or could not pay, there was banishment and outlawry for offenders. To be declared an outlaw or needing meant you were erased from society. No one could offer you food, shelter, or protection. You were completely on your own, and in fact, anyone was free to kill you and could even collect a reward for it. Meaning that you could have several bounty hunters after you, hunting you like game. You could be banished for a few years, but sometimes it was for life. Being outlawed was essentially a death sentence, unless you were cunning enough to outrun your hunters and carve out a life in exile, something very few did. One of the most infamous outlaws in Viking history was Eric the Red. He was outlawed twice. The first time he was forced to relocate within Iceland, and another time he was banished from Iceland for 3 years. With nowhere else to go, he set sail for a land unknown to his enemies and founded the first Viking settlement in Greenland. Check out my video for more on Eric the Red. If you couldn't pay your debts, you could be enslaved. Even a free Viking could be dragged down to the lowest ranks of society if they fell into crushing debt. Becoming a slave meant years of back-breaking labor, surviving on scraps and leftovers, getting whipped, and sleeping in the stables like livestock. You were no longer your own person, you belonged to someone else. Even if you somehow worked off your debt and regained your freedom, life didn't suddenly become easy. Now penniless and with no land of your own, the only way to survive was to work for a wealthy Viking. The only difference between you and a slave was now better food, a proper bed, but still, you were no longer truly your own master. Viking slavery was brutal, and I've covered it in depth in another video. In Viking society, theft was not merely a petty misdemeanor, it was a stain on one's honor. To steal was to be branded a coward, because the victim was robbed of the chance to defend themselves, a right held sacred by the Vikings. Depending on the value and nature of the stolen item, punishment could be as brutal as having one's hand or ear severed, a permanent mark of disgrace. And the stakes were even higher when it came to betrayal. Hanging and beheading were the reserved punishments for the gravest offenses. For a proud Viking, hanging was an especially shameful way to die. A Viking who turned against their chieftain, king, or warband, whether by switching sides in battle, selling secrets, or conspiring against their leader, faced certain execution. In some sagas, traitors met their end immediately, without even the semblance of a trial, their fate sealed by an uncompromising justice. The murder of a close family member, kinslaying, was considered the worst offense of all, warranting immediate execution. Additionally, the assault or rape of a high-ranking woman was taken as a grave attack, not only on the individual but on her entire clan. In a society where Viking women enjoyed significant rights compared to their contemporaries, harming a chieftain's wife, a priestess, or any noblewoman was met with unyielding retribution and death. The Icelandic sagas is full of stories about outlaws, men who, once declared outside the protection of society, banded together in groups that functioned much like bandit gangs. These outlaw groups weren't organized under a single famous name, but rather appear throughout the sagas as collections of men who turned to violence and plunder after losing their legal and social standing. Stripped of legal protection, these individuals often found themselves forced to rely on one another, and some formed loosely organized gangs. Their activities could include terrorizing nearby settlements, stealing livestock, and even committing brutal acts against unarmed farmers. When rogue groups like these banded together, they were seen as an existential threat. The Icelandic sagas vividly recount the relentless hunts for these outlaw gangs, whose brutal fates were sealed by execution. In one example from the sagas, a man that had been outlawed refused to accept his fate. Gunnar of Hlíðarendi was a legendary warrior, but despite his strength and honor, it was his stubbornness that led to his downfall. A feud between families led him to kill several men. This meant he was banished and had to leave Iceland for 3 years or face death. But as he prepared to flee, he looked back at his farm and declared, "The hillside is so beautiful, it has never seemed so fair to me. Golden fields and freshly mown hay. I will not go away, I will stay at home." He stayed, knowing his enemies would come, but Gunnar fought many of them off, single-handedly. But when his bowstring snapped, he asked his wife, Hallgerdur, for a strand of her hair to fix it. She refused, bitterly replying, "I remember the slap you gave me," a chilling revenge from his wife. Gunnar knew he didn't stand a chance, and he stated, "Everyone has their own thing to be remembered for." Without a working bow, Gunnar was overwhelmed and killed on his doorstep. A tragic end for a hero whose pride and stubbornness sealed his fate. Hrafkal was a powerful chieftain obsessed with the god Freyr, whom he built a temple for. He also owned a sacred horse, Frey Faxi, which he swore would bring death to anyone who rode it without permission. One day, a young shepherd named Einar rode Frey Faxi to round up sheep, unaware of the oath. When Hrafkal discovered this, he mercilessly killed Einar despite knowing it was unjust. Einar's father Torbjorn sought justice, and with his nephew Samur, they overthrew Hrafkal, stripping him of power and land. Humbled, Hrafkal was forced to live as a simple farmer. Abandoning his devotion to Freyr, he became more just, but years later he regained power, and seeking revenge, he took back his lands from Samur, completing his redemption. Another one is Egil Skallagrimsson, a Viking poet who killed a man over an insult but was able to avoid being killed by talking his way out of punishment with poetry. But some texts mention something even worse, the blood eagle. The blood eagle is one of the most infamous and gruesome punishments associated with the Vikings. According to some texts, this brutal execution method involved cutting open a victim's back, snapping their ribs outward, and pulling their lungs out to resemble wings while the victim was still alive. But did this horrific act really happen, or is it just another saga exaggeration? The truth is unclear. Some historians argue that the blood eagle may be more of a myth, a vivid tale woven into Viking legends to highlight the savage nature of their justice system. Others, however, believe it could have been a real, albeit rare, punishment reserved for traitors or enemies of the Vikings. From the terrifying blood eagle to the harsh reality of outlawry and slavery, Viking punishments were as merciless as they were swift. But despite all this, the Vikings had a unique system that demanded respect, loyalty, and courage. Their justice wasn't just about strength, it was about survival. Thank you for holding on all the way to the end. Remember to subscribe.